When President Trump granted Attorney General William Barr broad powers to declassify documents related to government spying during the 2016 presidential election, what went through former Trump campaign advisor Carter Page's mind? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Today we sit down with Carter Page, founder and managing partner of Global Natural Gas Ventures, who was a volunteer advisor for the Trump 2016 campaign and a central character described in the discredited Steele Dossier. We discuss the defamation lawsuits Carter Page has launched, how being investigated by the FBI impacted both his personal and professional life, his pre-campaign contacts with the FBI, and his take on how President Trump is dealing with the whole situation. Carter Page, wonderful to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thanks for having me, Jan.
So Carter, where to start? You were the central figure of the Steele so-called dossier, and some pretty horrible things were written about you in there. It was used as a pretext to obtain a FISA warrant, which was then renewed repeatedly, and then multiple members of the Trump campaign and later the administration were spied on as a result. You've actually filed a defamation lawsuit against some of the stuff that was in the dossier, or perhaps all of it. Where do things stand with that right now?
So I have a few suits. One relates it was the initial suit I filed in the Southern District of New York in September of 2017. There was a lot of false pleadings by the U.S. Department of Justice prior to Attorney General Barr coming into office, and so that's on appeal right now. And so we should have oral arguments at some point over the summer, I believe. And I have a separate case against. Eventually, we learn beyond the defamatory news reports. We learned that, in October of 2017, we learned that it was actually, the DNC and Perkins Coie that was behind that. So I have a case against that, which is, there's a lot of falsehoods there, and so I'm considering options now that the truth is starting to come out, because they've been really resisting kind of telling the world about the reality of where that stands. So, they're both works in progress, but I'm confident that now that we have a Justice Department that's looking to, address these criminal activities, I think, we should have a lot more truth. And I'm cautiously optimistic that, things will proceed well in that regard.
In a moment, I want to ask you a little more about this Oklahoma lawsuit. But before I do, when President Trump, authorized the Attorney General to, declassification, what went through your mind?
I think each of those individuals are people that have great character and want to see what's best for the country.
Sorry, which individuals? Can you clarify?
President Trump, first of all, and Attorney General Barr. Listening to him in his, originally in his testimony in Congress for his confirmation hearings. It's obvious that he's a solid set of hands. I'm a former naval officer, and I remember there's some captains who really have great command of a ship, and others who are, more likely to run the ship aground. And I think we've had a long situation over recent years where things have really gone off the rails in the U.S. Department of Justice. And I think it was immediately obvious when I watched that. His testimony for his confirmation hearings, that he's really a solid set of hands. And I think, the steps he's been taking to reform the situation at DOJ and address head-on these crimes that were committed, I think is a positive step forward.
Is there anything in particular that you're looking to see declassified?
I think it's just been so ridiculous from the very beginning in terms of these falsehoods. It'll be interesting to see, how outrageous some of their assumptions were. Everything I've seen thus far is just, as more details come out, it just becomes on the face of it so outrageous that it's just. I'm glad that the full truth is starting to get out there. So I think, step by step, things are looking a lot better.
So tell me a little bit more about this lawsuit. I mean, you've been defamed as being an agent of a foreign power. All of this resulted in death threats originating from Oklahoma and so forth, and this is a piece of this lawsuit. Can you tell us more about the details?
Well, I think, there's two approaches. I think what's come out is I was always very confidential about my support of the U.S. government, both as a source for the FBI as well as the CIA. This, in comparison, and I was always a volunteer. If the U.S. government asked me to help with something or provide insights and information, I always tried to give them the most accurate information available, and I was always happy to help. Now you compare that to these false insights or made-up stories that the DNC consultants were feeding into the FBI and U.S. Department of Justice, and it's just two polar different worlds. So.
Right. And so tell me, and this is like, we'll cut this a little bit, but what about these death threats?
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I think there's different levels of libel and defamation. I think when it goes so far that of false stories that people from it was really the brunt of the injury was in Oklahoma, and I kept getting these calls, really running for a year, from October 2016 all the way till October 2017. And unfortunately, I asked for the FBI's support on that, and in these long series of interviews I had with them in March 2017, and not only did they do nothing, but they kept leaking more false information or things that really put me in a negative light, and they only continued. So it's pretty unfortunate.
So, well, let's jump back to the beginning a bit, okay? So you were, according to the special counsel, you were actually introduced to the Trump campaign by Ed Cox. Is that right?
Yes.
And how did that happen? How did that introduction happen?
Ed Cox is a great guy who I've known for a long time, and I was very enthusiastic about candidate Trump when he announced in June of 2015, and I had been traveling a lot and working a lot, but towards the end of 2015, I had reached out to Ed and mentioned that I was very enthusiastic, and I actually had previously worked with. Or I was a member of the New York delegation in 2008 for Senator McCain, who I knew for most of my life. I got to originally meet him while I was at the U.S. Naval Academy. Okay. But and he was a graduate, and I previously worked on Capitol Hill. So it was. Ed has been a great guy, and I mentioned that I was interested, and he passed my name along.
Okay, great. And what about Sam Clovis? How is he involved in those early days?
Sam is a really incredible U.S. military veteran, a person who, he's been a teacher, he's been a great, commander in the, squadron commander in the U.S. Air Force, an entrepreneur, just a great individual. So I got to know him a little bit during the campaign. So It's really unfortunate that he got dragged through so much of this craziness. So many lives were really, put through the ringer. And, Sam is one of those people who is high on that list in terms of people whose lives were negatively affected. But
you mentioned that you had dealings with the FBI prior to the campaign, actually quite a bit from what I understand. This wasn't really mentioned in the Mueller report at all. Do you think this is a fair omission?
Well, I think they were, every paragraph about me was basically spun, to sort of not really providing the full story. And, I got the sense that it was, which I thought was the same for a lot of people, most vividly with President Trump. I think it's things that have an obvious partisan agenda and unfortunately didn't really give the full sense of reality. And, you asked about the death threats. Right. That's one example, and I had told the special counsel when I was in the grand jury with them about that. And, they mentioned a lot of the things I had talked about, and none of that was mentioned. So it's, rather than showing everything that we were going through, it's just things to, essentially paint Trump supporters in the most negative light possible. Yeah.
And just a little more, what was the nature of your interactions with the FBI prior to all this?
Well, look, I typically don't talk about those things, but it was leaked. It was in the April of 2017 that one of the quote-unquote security director of the Senate Intelligence Committee had a girlfriend, and he was telling his girlfriend about this, the fact that I had supported the U.S. government. So, it's just another example of those partisan agendas coming out and people trying to spin things in a very negative way for Trump supporters.
And what was your role in the Buryakov case?
Yeah, that was one example.
Yeah.
So yeah. So I was a source, and I just mentioned some of the FBI had asked me some questions, and I told them a bit about that. So
essentially you were a trusted source, and then suddenly you're a spy?
Well, I think there's a lot of open questions, and I think people had some negative motivations on a lot of levels. So, but I'm hoping those things will be resolved in due course.
So Stephen Halper, he was outed as a alleged FBI informant last year, and he's suing for defamation. And I know you've interacted with him. Can you talk a little bit more about your interactions with him? And
I've been very careful. Having been through a situation where people said a lot of negative things about me, I always try to give people the benefit of the doubt. I'm a pretty easygoing, nice guy, trying not to damage anyone's reputation. So, there's been various allegations out there. He's someone that I met at he's a university professor. I had been a professor in the area of international political economy myself. So we had some things in common, and, I met him at a conference over the summer of 2016, and we had stayed in touch. And as far as I know, it was nothing more than that, but there's been various allegations. So I guess we'll end up seeing as some of these details eventually come out. But, I hope for the best. I just tried to, be a positive force, someone who's, has, decent relations and treat people with respect. And if people were acting in ways to damage me, then, and more specifically, really to damage President Trump, or then candidate Trump. So I think, that would be unfortunate, but I'm glad that people are now looking into what exactly happened through this very tumultuous time in U.S. history.
I wanted to ask you a little more about some of this other cast of characters that we know about. Like, for example, Azra Turk. Do you know who she is?
I don't think I've come across her,
okay.
Not that I can recall.
And what about George Papadopoulos? What's your impression of him?
I had very limited interactions with him. We had a lot of volunteers that would get together from time to time. He may have showed up at some of those. I just have no recollection. I think, one interesting question, there's been various allegations that some of these ridiculous FISA warrants that were taken out on me and these crazy applications with all kinds of nonsense in there may have had some allegations related to him. If that turns out to be true, it'll be even more ridiculous because, again, my relationship with him was very limited. We may have kind of crossed paths a few times, but anything he may or may not have been doing really had nothing to do with me. So I guess we'll see.
The last I'm aware of, you actually hadn't met the president.
No, I've still never met him. Yeah. So, but I did. He was a great inspiration during the campaign, and in terms of I attended a lot of rallies, and really that was a historic moment, a very positive moment, and being a part of that great turning point in U.S. history, I thought was very exciting on many levels. I feel really bad, everything that this has put him through, and really his whole administration. So I'm glad things are now being done to look into this. But it's really a great testimony to how much he's been able to accomplish despite all this craziness going on in the background related to these outrageous made-up investigations based on these completely false pretenses. And I guess, as you say, I'm an example of that outrageous phenomenon.
So yes, the Attorney General is now looking into the origins of the Russia probe. He has people doing specific investigations. I'm curious, have you been contacted by anyone, by FBI, DOJ, Office of the Inspector General?
No, I haven't. I spent a lot of time with the FBI back in 2017, but and various congressional committees have asked me questions, and again, as I've alluded to on a lot of occasions, I'm just trying to get the truth out there. So to the extent people have questions, I'm happy to help, but I think we'll have to wait and see here.
You said something, actually, speaking exactly of this, these conversations with the FBI, you once said that, I believe, that they never asked you one questions about doing anything illegal. Is that right?
I've never, the questions about them asking me about things that I did, nothing that they even touched on could be viewed as illegal in any way. Even these false premises. I literally, I did nothing wrong. So I think people, there may have been a lot of attempts to trip me up, but there's really no there.
So, okay, let's jump to the FISA warrant. So the details of the FISA warrant still remain classified. That might be something we learn more about with this declassification. It's unclear how extensive the intelligence that the FBI was able to gather, because the way it works, just for those in the audience that might know, right, as soon as you're a target, then the people you connect with are a legitimate target, legitimate in quotes, and then the people they're connected with are also, quote, legitimate targets. And so it could be a very, very broad reach. What was the extent of your contacts after the time, roughly, when that first FISA
contacts with.
With the campaign people, just to get a sense of the scope.
It's funny because there were these defamatory reports that started coming out on September 23rd, 2016, basically the day that changed my life. And, there was a lot of reporters that were being pitched by the DNC consultants, being pitched this false story. And a lot of top news agencies and newspapers and New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, they're all calling me. Wall Street Journal, for example. None of them bit. Everyone, I think, realized, a legitimate reporter would realize just how insane some of these stories are, or these false allegations are. But eventually they found someone, and it led to a real firestorm. So, and at that time, I took a leave of absence from the campaign, and everyone, pretty much everyone I spoke with, volunteers who were part of our, supporting the campaign, they all said, well, you're still part of the Trump movement, this is, and actually if you listen to President Trump's victory speech, or then, President-elect Trump on the night, late on the election night, in November 2016, he said, this is not a campaign, this is a movement, And it's interesting because people that are trying to cover up the illegitimate surveillance, they like to say, well, he had already left the campaign, so we're spying on him, but he's not really part of the campaign. Well, that's false in a lot of different ways. Number one, I was just on a leave of absence, and if you're on a leave of absence from your from any affiliation, you're still, part of that great,
Sure.
Again, as President-elect Trump said, this is not a campaign; it's a movement. So, but I also stayed in touch with people, more to the point, and going back to your question on the spying. So, Unfortunately.
So, how many people do you think, since the FBI obtained the FISA, you interact with? But I mean, ballpark.
It's hard to say, but it's
a lot.
a fair number. Unfortunately, it created a lot of chaos. But I did stay. One name that that came up is some conversations and texts I had with Steve Bannon, for example. But it's unfortunate there. Not only my privacy was invaded, but a lot of other innocent Americans as well.
So let's talk a little bit about that. Actually, you said the day your life changed, and so how has your personal life been affected by this?
Well, really, I like to. The way I think about it is, as an Annapolis graduate from the U.S. Naval Academy, I had some great military training. But the training that ended up, although I did a lot in terms of national security, military affairs, et cetera, the training that actually turned out to be the most valuable and relevant was a anti-terrorist training that I went through at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And, given all the terror threats that I lived through during this period.
It sounds bizarre. Anti-terrorism training is the thing that was most useful to you. How does that work?
Well, I think, people that have their lives put at risk, there are a lot of tactical things that you can do to basically protect yourself, when you're out on your own. And unfortunately, these crazy stories unleashed this complete hysteria, and a lot of people actually got caught up in it. So I think, as a practical matter and as things that were very helpful, that was by far, in retrospect, although, I had a great educational experience in my many years in the military, that, turned out, unfortunately, to be the most immediately valuable and, important.
Terror threats as a result of being fingered in the dossier.
Yeah, well, and just these false allegations,
Yeah.
you know, which took me from being a totally unknown figure to an infamous person, you know, sort of notoriously known worldwide, you know, based on complete lies. So, and you know, there's a lot of people that unfortunately bought into it for a while. So, yet another reason why it's important to get the full truth out there.
How are you participating in getting that truth out now?
Well, you know, I think one way is through, you know, various litigation, and you know, as you alluded to, I have a few lawsuits, but I believe, you know, now that we may be getting some more of this information, I believe there will be significant additional claims, but it's still open. We'll have to see how it plays out. But I'm cautiously optimistic, and by all indications, the fact that people are actually taking serious these crimes that were committed against President Trump and supporters of his, like mine, I think is a positive development.
So, and obviously your career got hit with a sledgehammer here.
Yeah, you know, I've always was as a volunteer for the Trump campaign, had a great passion for international relations, international political economy. This turning point in American history has given me a new interest and love for the law. You know, I had been a legal officer on my ship. I always obeyed the law and supported our country. But you know, the things where I saw the tremendous crimes that were committed against me as a way of trying to advance this coup against President Trump, I think, you know, was a eye-opening experience, and I think it's made me appreciate the way the law should operate. It's unfortunate that it was not respected by these government bureaucrats who were doing these evil acts against President Trump. But you know, it's interesting understanding some of the legal and constitutional questions that are closely related to these criminal activities. So that's, even though I haven't been able to stay engaged as much in terms of my intellectual interests on the international relations front, I think having so much of my energy focused on resolving these criminal activities has been, you know, extremely interesting and, you know, an important turning point for our country.
And aside from, you know, getting, I suppose, hopefully or possibly some closure with the lawsuits, the litigation, what does the road to normalcy look like even at this point? Do you see a path?
Well, you know, I've always just wanted what's best for our country, and I've, you know, done my best. You know, part of the reason I always refer to this DNC dossier as the dodgy dossier is because, you know, in 2002 and 2003 was the original, that term dodgy dossier was originated for the first time. And that's when the US and the UK governments were putting together this false intelligence report as a way to sell the population of the US and Great Britain for the war in Iraq. And unfortunately, you know, that original dodgy dossier from 2002 and 2003 led to thousands of lives lost. And so, although this has been a painful and difficult process for our country, for President Trump and, you know, some of his supporters like me, you know, I look at it from a pretty big picture perspective and realize, number one, it could have been a lot worse, and number two, we're lucky that we have a president who was able to kind of cut through this false story and this, you know, real illegitimate noise, unlike what eventually happened in Iraq with the original dodgy dossier, which led to so much death and destruction. So although things have been pretty rough, it's nowhere near as bad as it could have been if we didn't have leadership in the White House and in this new administration looking to keep moving and advancing on their agenda.
So, Carter, what are your plans for the immediate future?
I think, we're at a big turning point, and now that there's been so much done, so many steps are being taken by the U.S. Department of Justice and other parts of the American government to dig into this. I think we're really entering a new era where there's real facts in terms of what exactly happened. We've been in this alternative reality for the last couple of years with these crazy stories that really derailed our country in many ways, or could have derailed it if our president had been effectively blocked as people were trying to do to him. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I think there'll be a lot of positive developments, but it's a very time-consuming process, particularly from the legal perspective in terms of thinking through some of these issues and, helping to get the truth out there.
And so despite all this, do you think you'll stay involved in politics? I say that in a very broad way.
I think some of the people I worked with in the Trump movement as a volunteer in 2016, they're really some of the best people I've met in my life. And, I think there is a passion for, service and helping to think through and work on key strategic projects and keep strategic ideas for the positive development of our country and for the world. And so, these are areas where, as a former university professor and as a business leader, I've made contributions in the past. And I think despite a lot of downside and a lot of pain that this has caused for myself and so many other people, I think there's important lessons to be learned. And I hope to, I think as a lot of people have said, both in Congress and in the U.S. government, we really need to make sure that this never happens again. So I think that
you want to play a part of that. You want to be a part of that.
Well, I think getting the truth out there and allowing people to understand, what happened and how the law should operate, as opposed to these. This concept of abusive process where this sacred court system is really, turned into complete shambles. So I'm happy that steps are being taken to fix that situation right now.
Great. So is there anything you can share with us? Anything on the horizon? Any news?
Well, it sounds like there's going to be a lot of news very soon. And, I think, unfortunately, so up until this point, there's been a lot of the old saying fake news, completely made up stories that were paid for by some illegitimate political operatives, part of the DNC and the Democrat Party. And thankfully, I think, people are looking into that, and there's definitely going to be a lot coming out in the very near future. So it's going to be a lot of excitement, I'm quite sure, in the weeks and months to come.
Carter Page, wonderful to speak with you.
Great to speak with you, Jan. Thanks for having me.